I want to try and bring you the world in which I have been steeped, which is not only that of writing these lectures quite feverishly at times from week to week, but also of teaching at Hopkins and of finding that what I have been offering you in this class has benefited tremendously from the work of students who worked with me in this difficult, unusual semester where we had to move from campus experiences to teaching on Zoom and teaching remotely. And that was my part, teaching, but it was communicating with students in discussions and in written work that took a completely different format as we had to adjust to the changes brought in by COVID-19. And the names that you're seeing on the screen here are the names and the location of the students whose work I am going to be using and dwelling on it in certain places as one way of introducing you to the Hopkins now question. That is, the Austen now, the Hopkins now are connected because we are all engaged in an adventure where we're trying to closely and remotely, geographically I know there is a vast spread of participants here. So we are all in that same space where we're asking ourselves paradoxically in the midst of a crisis, a health crisis, and a very difficult moment emotionally for many of us, we're asking ourselves, why read Austen and what are we reading in Austen? And I am very, very grateful actually to the three questions that I received just a little while ago, because they remind me to what degree you are yourselves connected to this adventure, the you being this time, not my students at Hopkins, but you who have followed with attentiveness and with real insight, actually, what I have been trying to share with you. And I'm well aware that what I'm sharing with you is sometimes dense, difficult, adventurous even, but you've picked up the kinds of threads in my presentation that are central to my inquiry here, and in fact that you will see reappear. So what about those questions? Well, I decided that I could conflate a question that came from Jane and another one that came from Marianne. And this is a question that is central, in fact, to the way in which I've been approaching these two books that we've been studying, namely the question of the relation between the author and her imaginary creations. Does an author actually create, we might say, imaginary friends as she or he writes? And this is a question that has been central to a lot of my thinking about fiction, and that I am most inclined to approach, in fact, by emphasizing for you, perhaps, the idea that in my way of thinking about the novel, but also in my way of talking about it, you may have picked it up, I often talk in terms of a scene. Even though I'm not thinking movies, I'm thinking a scene in fiction. What I am assuming is that just as in the same way as on a stage or in a movie, you can actually create intensities of feelings or revelations that have to do with meaning by positioning yourself in relation to an element of the story from a distance, from a side, from a place where you can actually stage the emotion or stage the meaning. In that scene that the novels produce, two very important things happen. One of them is that the scene becomes a place where we are brought in through identification or projection, and we share the moment with an unusual interest or commitment. Not the same when you're reading a description, but when you read a scene in a book, you know when you're reading a great scene, as you know that when your tears are bringing on your eyelids, that you're reading or watching a great film that has produced a scene of sentimental strength and emotion that you're relating to. So that scene actually happens in Jane Austen all the time, except that it happens in very discrete ways and only at times with a kind of intensity that at that point alerts you, the viewers, but also alerts me, the literary critic, to the kinds of intensities of affect and emotion that the creator has put into staging moments in her novel. That staging of moments in the novel, I want to emphasize, is not intentional. It just happens. And it just happens by a logic which, it won't surprise you, is for me actually a Freudian logic. Freud, who was very curious about how we inhabited a world of fantasy, was always interested in literature, but not a literary scholar. But what he was capable of realizing as he thought about how literature worked in terms of phantasmatic projections, what he was capable of imagining is that the creative writer lives in a state of daydreaming, of feverish at times activity, of compensatory fiction, so to speak, of places where you can let loose of the constraints that surround you. You can forget that you're confined and hemmed in by the conventions and the rules and the principles of your culture. And you can imagine yourself in a completely different place. And this is where I want to end for now, because the theme will reemerge regularly in what I'm saying today. This is where I want to end by saying to you, well, it's one of the most fascinating things for me to reread these poignant scenes, especially in Persuasion, in the light of the fact that there are ways of projecting into a life of imagination what had become for the author sheer impossibilities. And she does that in other ways as well. One of the aspects of the question I'm teaching has to do with how does she do it with male characters? Well, all the time. She has us fall in love, so to speak, with Wentworth, maybe not, or with Mr. Knightley, maybe not, but certainly what she does do for us is that she makes us feel the emotion that is that of being in love with a partner that has been chosen, that seems desirable and that exists for us, even though just a creature made of paper, exists for us because of some amazing intensity of feeling that we recognize in the character. So this leads me actually to the question of confinement. Confinement, as was picked up by Gretchen, is actually a central question. We need to talk about confinement because we wouldn't be here if we weren't, to some degree, all of us in a place, a situation, a moment where a part may be experiencing some kind of solitude or even just boredom. We are eager to break away from that sense of isolation by reading books, by watching TV series, by going virtually to the movies, as we will for the next session. But what are we doing there? Actually, we are also experiencing at our level the kind of I am locked up in my head with my emotion in a space experience that meets almost symmetrically, in fact, the kind of imagination that we are studying as we are looking together today, with more emphasis perhaps on Persuasion, the balance between Emma and Persuasion. And what do I mean by balance? There is an interesting balancing act here, to the extent that Emma seems to give us the kind of ecstatic and joyous version and the humorous version of that quest for breaking away from the obsessiveness and the solitude of one's mind. In fact, you could say Emma finds a substitute in writing scripts all the time for marriages that she is excluded from because she hasn't found a way in. Well, that's the happy story. The more melancholic story is the one that I want to put at the upfront, in fact, of our reflection, because we are perhaps in very discreet and yet in very powerful ways, all of us living in the shadow of that melancholia of lost things, of nostalgia, of feelings that seem to be hard of access to us because we are so cut off from the intimacies of personal relations. I mean, this is one of the things about confinement. You don't just meet with those you love. You don't just hug them. And hugging or kissing is certainly not a theme that we see in Jane Austen. But in the negative, one understands also that even in her careful dance of feelings, Jane Austen is actually capable of making us live, so to speak, the passions that keep us alive as we keep imagining that we're going to break away and be free and be able to imagine again a life of pleasures, among which the pleasures of personal, intimate, familial relationships of the kind that are spread out in the tapestry of her work. So this is actually by way almost of a concluding move in the course, and it means that I may be able to move a little faster as I get to the conclusion of my talk today. But we still have quite a journey ahead as we have to learn, I think, a few more things about how and why Austen has been such a source of fascination for us, but also a source of considerable difficulty and puzzlement. I remind you here of the questions that are ours. And the questions that are ours here are those that involve a denouement, an end of persuasion that is rather unique and actually rather difficult to unpack. We are, so to speak, lifted out of a world of plotting and action in the novel that emphasizes spirits dancing in the rapture. And here I grab my copy of the passage that I'm looking at because I just want to refresh your memory. There could be not an objection. There could only be a most proper alacrity, a most obliging compliance for public view, and smiles reigned in, and spirits dancing in private rapture. And we now follow, as in a kind of fade out, we follow Anne and Wentworth as they go down a street. It's called Union Street in Barthes, and they take shelter in the comparatively quiet and retired gravel walk, not to kiss, not to hug, note, but to have another conversation. And there we hear they exchanged again those feelings and those promises which had once seemed to secure everything, but which had been followed by so many, many years of division and estrangement. There they returned into the past, more exquisitely happy, perhaps, in their reunion. Now that is the moment of denouement. What we found now is that there must be a way, and there is a way, for Jane Austen to speak about the rapture of being in love, but in a way that is so difficult. And as I say difficult, I'm actually thinking of what was my experience when I tried to teach this passage to my students, whose names you saw a little while ago on the screen. They couldn't get it. It took us more than a class, in a way, to come to that place where we could understand that instead of a kind of spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings between two lovers, that you see in Emma, that we studied in Emma, we didn't read Emma, but it was you, I studied Emma, in spite of that lively dialogue and the obvious moves towards a romantic paradigm, the dancing spirits in Persuasion are held back. They do dance, of course, but they dance a dance that is much more discreet than one would expect. And I do want to mention here, precisely because of the questions that you, my audience, raised today, I do want to mention that I haven't forgotten the emphasis I had put on the word dance. In fact, the woman who writes about spirits dancing in rapture is the very same woman who, next to her piano, treasures the dances she attended in her late 30s and teasingly called herself and her sister in that double act. They called themselves the Formidables. How modern is that? How interesting it is to actually see that transcending all the kinds of hemmed-in emotions, Jane Austen summons up for the ending of this novel the dancing spirit that must have been that of her youth, the one where she knew that there was nothing more rapturous than to be with others on the dance floor, and perhaps to assume that there might be there the one object of love that you're going to find and who might seduce you or whom you might seduce. But that's, you'll have to acknowledge, very different from what happens when we read the ending of Emma. And I have helped you by offering you the prompting, so to speak, of George Steiner's writings. But do you probably remember, and maybe you even thought a bit more about this brilliant formulation that describes Emma's state of mind. And note the emphasis. With Emma, we're looking at a state of mind. And yet that state of mind is filled with romanticism because it dwells in the language of romanticism. It darted through her with the speed of an arrow that Mr. Knightley must marry no one but herself. The dense, the compacted formulation here could be that of a poet, but she's not a poet, in fact. The formulation of sentiment that she offers us is really, I would say, the luminous reinvention of an imaginist who unknowingly would have to learn later about the shadow of illness. The major difference between Emma and Persuasion is perhaps time, the timing of the writing. The timing of the writing means that while you're privy to some of the ecstasies of simple romantic love in Emma, what you see in Persuasion is a different mood. And here I will move relatively fast over a section of last time's lecture that prompts, in fact, these commentaries about a different mood. I remind you that I said to you, while thinking about the mood of Persuasion, I came upon a new interpretation of a piece of music by Beethoven called For Elise. I don't know if you had the time, the chance, or the inclination to actually listen to the links that we gave you, chosen because they were, we felt, particularly meaningful interpretations. If you haven't yet, maybe you should, because nothing, I think, can bring you closer to what's so difficult to describe and express analytically, namely the feeling, the emotions that are those of a soul that is confined, solitary, isolated in their pain. And when I put it in the plural, I want to say that that pain is for everyone, but I also want to actually zoom in for a moment on a comparison or a relationship that one can build between Jane Austen and Beethoven, who lived more or less at the same time and who had one thing in common, namely the fact that because of illness, you probably know that Beethoven was getting increasingly deaf. Because of illness for Jane Austen, they were kept away from a world where they could have experienced the pleasures of perceptions, the arts, of emotions and conversations, and of meeting people with absolute immediacy. They were locked in, both of them, at some point, in a place that put them in the sidelines, on the sidelines. And it is, for example, from the sidelines that I think I began to understand, looking at that emotion, that Anne Elliot in Persuasion is actually like a muse for Jane Austen. That Anne Elliot is the luminous image of someone who actually can relive the past and can reimagine a plotting for her life that pulls her away from what have been, as you know from reading the novel, the signs of serious melancholia and the signs of a loss of vitality that seems to have been powerfully driven by her melancholia. Now, I want to actually emphasize the vitality of that moment. I want to emphasize it as I quote to you the words of Shakespeare's autumnal sonnet. The vitality was that, I would say, of the need to love that well, which thou must leave ere long, to love that well, which you must leave before long. There is a kind of farewell in that novel, a farewell to a certain world, but also a farewell to the possibility of imaginative creation that was the life of Jane Austen. Now, let me move to the spectrum of reflections that my students in my class offered as building our course around persuasion. We understood that there was much more in Jane Austen than just a place to reflect on mature love of a melancholy type. The titles are here not for any other reason than to just give you a sense of the range of the papers, but also just to give you a few anchoring points as I try to sum up for you some of the important ideas that we rehearsed together in the now, that I worked with a generation of new readers, of new viewers as well. We also used film, but of a generation of young people who, just as we were, or as we are, have been trying to figure out what it means to enter into a world of sentiment and how one gets educated into loving in ways that are meaningful and in ways that we can stand by. So, for example, I'll begin with mentioning Evgenia. Evgenia's work was one that was focused on the idea of fleeting moments of passionate living in the characters, of persuasion, but also on the kind of despondency or depression that one can detect in the configurations that are those of Anne's psychology. She imagines that the prospects of the female character that is Anne is actually there, that these prospects are structured by male desire. That is actually part of her title. She believes that Anne is trapped in a place where she is asked to inhabit her femininity to such a degree that all she's given by way of a life, in fact, by way of a career plan, Evgenia writes, all she's given is the role of caring and nurturing, whereas what she's actually experiencing and where her need lies is in overcoming or transcending that early moment of her life when her attachment to Captain Wentworth, and here I'm citing Evgenia, filled with regrets, had clouded every enjoyment of youth and had led, I continue to cite Austen here, cited by Evgenia, had led to an early loss of bloom and spirits that had a lasting effect. The course I was teaching had as a title, Love and Its Maladies. And because of that, moving fast, a little bit fast, I would mention just that I received excellent, enriching work that had to do with the interfacing, so to speak, between the isolation or the depression of characters who are cut away from what they desire, and on the other hand, the presence in their world of overt conditions and situations and of cultural paradigms that in fact place them or confine them in the role of being sick. One of the places where this was studied is in a very probing piece of work by Shreya, who examined, and I highly recommend that reading, Susan Sontag's book on illness as a metaphor, and who understood that the question is not so much that of, are our characters made ill by the life conditions that unfold ahead of them, or are they in fact from the beginning defined by some kind of a character trait that makes them melancholy? No, 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 this is not how you must reason, says Shreya. What you must actually understand is that in their symptoms, characters in fiction, just like the characters they are in real life, actually are subjects in search of decipherment and interpretation. They are subjects, they are human beings for whom passion has translated into some kind of a symptomatic presentation of symptoms. On a very different scale, Mariana comes to a different conclusion. And I say on a different scale because I want to show you how close we came actually in one of our readings in my course, namely in reading Death in Venice by Thomas Mann, how close we came to an acknowledgement that there are in the literary corpus of Western literature, and perhaps also in other literatures, but certainly of Western literature, a whole number of fictions, including Death in Venice, that seem like anticipations of what we are experiencing. Death in Venice, a short novella, a wonderful film, which you may know about, or if you don't, could be added to your reading list, is a book about the intersection between falling in love and the temptation of an impossible attachment to a beautiful young man. Impossible because transgressive, impossible because whereas that attachment makes of the hero of the book, Aschenbach, a man who is never felt as alive as he is when he is in Venice, whereas he feels tremendously alive, he also understands as the rumors are growing in the city of Venice, as the smells are increasing, as more and more people are leaving the city, he understands that there is an epidemic there, and that epidemic is that of cholera. And maybe I shouldn't give you the ending. I will give you a sense of the ending, though, to say that this is a book, a novella, that actually raises the question of what do you do when all your dreams, including the most intimate dream of and fantasy of being in love for once with the absolute object of desire, what do you do when you find out that that object of desire actually keeps you, and one might even want to say drags you down into a world that will be your demise? So we are, with these glimpses of my students' work, we are looking at what is perhaps, for me, one of the central lessons of reading Austen for our time, which is the lesson precisely about how we spend our time. And the most adventurous, maybe, of the students in my class, the one who was the most willing to take intellectual risks, you see her name at the end here, Isha, who studied Romeo and Juliet, La Traviata, and the very interesting recent film, Call Me By Your Name, came to the conclusion that the only aspects of love that we need to understand is that love is, in a almost vulgar idiom, just a flash in the pan. It's just something that happens in an ecstatic moment of feeling, but that, in fact, the very ecstasies of being in love depend on the short intensity of the moment, on the ways in which, think Romeo and Juliet, when they are on the balcony or when they're gradually drifting into that bedroom, how that romantic moment thrives precisely because it can only be brief and intense and secretive. And with that, I think I am actually ready to bring you to a novel that is not Romeo and Juliet, by no means, but is not La Traviata either. It doesn't have that fullness and the expressivity of passion and emotion and illness, but certainly a novel that is capable of showing you how the exquisitely subtle plottings of persuasion do bring you back to this one and only and central truth about what romantic love is about, namely, when you see your love object, you know it is the one. You know that he, she, they are the ones for whom you're willing to live, but you're also maybe willing to die. And the best way of giving you access to that form of thinking lies in the reading I gave you, knowing well that we were going to move to a place where we needed to somehow condense what had been our learning experience about love. And the word discourse is a word I want to feature here. It is a word that seems very odd. To lovers' discourse suggests that love is only talk. Roland Barthes, who is the author of this brilliant modern study of the experience of love, which is partly inflected by autobiographical experiences. Roland Barthes, who in Richard Howard's brilliant translation is accessible as a, as a kind of vademecum about how to think about modern love, has given us an alphabet, so to speak, of what makes up the idea of love. And here, naturally, adorable sprang to mind for me as I was thinking about how to make it clear that indeed, among the millions of objects, the millions of bodies, the millions of images of love that we will have seen in a life, we will always know the one that designates for me, I'm citing the slide here, the specialty of my desire. And the specialty of my desire actually leads me to mention, and that is a central element in what I want to come back to with you, which is the central element that has to do with the gender of loving, with the gender of the objects, with the gender as a constraint on the dimensions of desire. We'll look at that in a moment, but for the immediate, I just want to draw your attention to the work of two of the students also listed on my slides. One of them, Asud, who was assisting me in this course when we studied Austen, and Asud, who also, after a viewing of the rather frank but deeply interesting film Call Me By Your Name, the film that is based on André Aciman's novel, Asud, who directed the discussions in my class on the theme of sexual awakening. Here is one place we have been directed to in our conversations about Austen's work, but also in the work that we did in my class. And the other one is Tiffany, whose title is Soulmates, the Influence of Cultural Norms on Monogamy in Literature, and who writes, in the romance literature and films that we encountered in this class, the story centers around soulmates. The main couples are each other's one true love. She then continues, in many cultures, heterosexual monogamous relationships are considered the social norm. Therefore, polyamorous individuals, as well as their experiences and relationships, are often prevented from having the love life that they truly desire. Clearly, as I mention the work of my students who are so close to having a finger on the pulse of our contemporary reflections on what is desire, on what is loving, and of questions that have to do with gender, it would seem that their project are in a place that is so different from what we've been talking about, that it would suggest that Jane Austen's writings are really meaningless for the contemporary generations. But in the excitement, in the enthusiasm, in the hard work that my students promoted and did in my class, I understood, and I want to repeat it here and want to show you why, that Jane Austen, in her writings, with her writings, has lost none of the value when it comes to prompting us to rethink and actualize our beliefs about what loving entails. So here is a return to the slide that announces, so to speak, a sliding and a moving into another aspect of the course. And I don't need to dwell on it because we actually looked at it quite closely when we last time discovered Mrs. Elton with her strawberries. What we learned by looking at Mrs. Elton with her strawberries goes far beyond just a study of her character. But what we learned, in fact, is how in Jane Austen's amazing plotting of her novel, in Emma, we actually discover in her, Mrs. Elton, but also elsewhere. Amazing configurations of desire that have nothing to do with romanticism. Configurations of desire, for one thing, that are highly invested in narcissism. Think, for example, of the haircut anecdote. Frank Churchill, and he has many reasons for that, prefers to have his hair cut in London, not in Highbury. Think, for example, about the buzz in the little community of Highbury when we understand that there might be a new car in town. What I mean by new car is that Mr. Perry, guess what, might be getting a new gig. Well, you may remember also that that new gig is, of course, in the plotting of the novel, the very evidence of an unfortunate blunder made by Frank Churchill, and that is a deep source of embarrassment for Jane Fairfax, as in fact this piece of information, that scoop about the new fashion in town, even doctors, even apothecaries, actually, he's just an apothecary, Mr. Perry can actually now have a vehicle at their disposal to do their work. This is that other angle that I need to emphasize for you. And I want to emphasize it also because it is one of the ways in which we come back to the distinctions and the differences that we need to be able to make between that world of modernity that we actually begin to explore with Jane Austen, especially in Emma, and a different kind of reading, the one that makes of Jane Austen a much more subdued, a chaster, a more prudish figure maybe than I think is warranted, but one that nevertheless we cannot escape from. We cannot escape from the fact that gender is connected to sex in Jane Austen in ways that are so tightly embedded in a culture that we cannot but reflect on the contrast between the two worlds, the older, enlightened, reasonable, controlled, confined almost world of Austenian desire, and what happens on the other side of the fence and is beginning to develop in the plottings that are part of Emma. Transparency on one side, innuendo, and elusiveness on the other hand, not a kiss, as I said earlier. Sentiment and bashfulness with Austen, sex and erotic imagination, though subdued but still present and increasingly visible, in fact, in the literature that develops after Austen. Remember that the contrast that Steiner dwells on is that between Jane Austen and, well, D.H. Lawrence. Note also the contrast between the private and ecstatic and because ineffable experiences of that dancing of the spirits in rapture that defines Persuasion, and the public and look at me and eroticized body of many of the figures that are not very palpably present in the fiction, but certainly that you're going to discover when you watch the film. Look at me, fashionable, trying to attract your attention in what I wear is precisely not what Austen was interested in when she was trying to imagine desire. Desire is an intimate experience for her. One of the students in the class, Claire, tried to understand to what degree desire, love, the choice of a love object, and even the plotting of the novel depended on a very finely tuned guide of conduct, so to speak, that we had studied or encountered in my class and that we've seen last time, what we saw last time, namely this map of feelings called a map of tender. I suggested you look also at a link, so I won't explain more about the item itself, but note how Claire decided to use that slide as a way of making sense of Anne Elliot's experience. And look also at how she concludes what are the results of that carefully plotted, carefully thought through set of small gestures, none of them out of place, that end with the happy, ecstatic happiness of Wentworth and Anne Elliot. The plotting, the work done there is that of both, you could say, of both the writer and the characters. The two are intertwined. But look now at the counter-argument. The counter-argument here is one that insists that we may be too naive when we think of love as the slide that you have on the right, as that beautiful romantic, Romanesque one-to-one encounter where you just know that he or she or they are the one and the rest of the world disappears. What René Girard, and I mention him in passing, but actually would want to give him more space even in his presentation. René Girard is one of the most interesting thinkers on desire that one will ever have a chance to read, I think. And he offered us a groundbreaking framework to rethink some of the prejudices, no, maybe some of the blind spots we had when it came to understanding love. He's all the more important for us as he was for someone who taught for a good number of years, did his research on this book when he was at Johns Hopkins. Title of his two books, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, in French, Mensonge romantique and Vérité romanesque. What does René Girard tell us about love that we didn't know? He tells us that we should be suspicious of believing always or investing always in the idea that whenever we love and desire, what we love and desire is absolutely spontaneous, our own, singular to me and to you, and that the only way we actually do love is in the transparency of a relationship with somebody else who is our soulmate, as Tiffany would write, a soulmate. No, actually, love is often not about soulmates. And we owe to René Girard the brilliant insight and ability to demonstrate something that is present in all the novels of Jane Austen. And in fact, even though he doesn't write about Jane Austen, a patterning that is present in most of the novels that we read between the early 19th century up into the beginnings of modernity, that is the beginning of the 20th century, he points out that we love by indirection. Every top of a triangle identifies a love object. Every signage for those triangles, and I'm very grateful to Clara Kreithart for helping me work on this slide, every one of these slides actually shows you the indirections of desire, that we actually love by rivalry, through envy, in competition, that in fact, we love mimetically. Maybe we would never know how to love if we hadn't read books, for example. or if we hadn't watched a film. Maybe we would never know how to love if we hadn't seen somebody else love the person we thought was going to be our own. And of course here, I don't need to cite it again, but here, Emma's amazing moment of recognition, well, Mr. Knightley could love no one but herself, must love no one by herself, is in fact the vivid instantiation of that triangle that puts her in rivalry with Harriet and actually defines the love that she has for Mr. Knightley. I am overemphasizing the triangles, but I want you to see them because this is the only way for us to actually move away from what might be a too idealistic, a too idealized view of what love can do. And if there's anything that we learned through Jane Austen, with Jane Austen, it is in fact that we can't be naive. Here are then a few of the ways in which we have actually learned through Austen about the test of characters that define the ways in which subjects, characters in fictions, maybe we ourselves have been asked to rethink our values. And I already placed you on a central slide, but I want you to know that, in fact, the different ways in which Jane Austen has actually made of the idea of character a central theme in her fiction. So, for example, character in her novel means something that has to do with strength, moral excellence, goodness, and also something has to do with moral choices. It has to do with how much compassion, sympathy, empathy, what kinds of generous actions and generous gestures are you capable of taking on? Are you capable of giving without counting? Can you donner sans compter? Are you willing to be generous? Anne is, if anything, immensely generous. Character is also what you show in Austen, as you show in your various embodiments, in your various, in the figures of the novel, how we human beings are actually to shape our lives in response to circumstances. For example, think of the heroism and courage on display in Persuasion, on a large and on a small scale, with Wentworth, the Crofts, or Captain Harville. Or think of the labor involved in attending more modestly, and often, not always, the woman's role, to feelings and to weaknesses. And here we have probably the youngest student in our class, whom I picked up not from a classroom, but actually in a piece in the New York Times. I have already used this proposition. Mommy fixes people, daddy fixes things. The importance, the value of emotional labor, the ways in which it actually defines the space of experiences that have to do with love, but also have to do with others in Jane Austen's fiction, that emotional labor is, I think, a central notion that we need to bear in mind as we end our course. Part of that has to do with children. I already showed you these slides last time, but here they are. I add these ones. Which you might want to look at again, just to show you also in a picture that's on the left of my slide, what seems to me like an emblem for our time, for both the happiness, but also maybe the challenges of motherhood, of being both a woman with a career, a woman with a job, or a woman who whose job it is to want to be with her children and to educate them and to see what it takes. It's not only the fun and the pleasures, but children, modern parenthood, and that's something I had never seen until I actually taught you in this class. Modern children are actually much more present in this book than I ever imagined. And I have spent quite a bit of time working on childhood. And so are, of course, dear to my heart, the themes that have to do with writing. Writing partly because I might as well owe up to this simple fact. Writing has been the reason for my return and for my questioning this level of engagement and maybe also at this depth. This level of engagement, this depth, is due to the fact that I saw in Jane Austen's representation of a culture on the cusp of modernity very important elements of a reflection that is central to my own project, which is a book on handwriting. I was attentive to those moments. I gave you a reading about those moments, about the glory of the postal service, but also about the importance and the significance of receiving a letter in the mail for Jane Fairfax. But I also want to bring you to the way in which somebody like myself works when one is a researcher. I bring you to this slide because this slide with Mr. Wentworth penning a letter in a room where Anne Elliot is present, where all it would take is to walk up to her and actually whisper in her ear, "We need a moment to talk," which can be engineered in the world of Jane Austen's fiction. No, this slide is a representation for me of a conundrum that I have been trying to figure out. Why is it that instead of speaking to Anne, Wentworth actually takes to the pen? I have different answers to that, and I could talk about the need for authority, maybe a desire to be perceived more clearly, maybe a need to slow down what is happening all too quickly in that moment when so many people are talking about so many different things and so many voices are heard. Maybe because, practical as he is and serious and determined to get it right this time, Wentworth thinks that the best way of communicating with the woman who he understands is now actually the one. That best way of communicating depends on the pen. I talk about this as just yesterday on public radio, national radio, we had Emily Post talking about the etiquette of sending handwritten notes, not only of condolence, but of friendship, of sympathy, or of celebration. We write all the time. We know that. We Twitter, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, we speak, we dictate. But one of the points where I would like to actually zoom in one last time is to say we actually are, as readers and as understanding that the value of writing is not merely practical. We are involved in a kind of emotional labor that is our own, dealing with our own emotions, but also we are involved in a project that has to do with what it means to be able to express and to communicate in writing. And you know that we learn to write from reading books. We know to write about how we love from reading books as well. After all, that's what Girard has told us. So what would it mean to learn to love and to learn to write or to learn to communicate with the language of Jane Austen? Well, what it would mean, no doubt, is that we would revisit our desire and our needs for communication. We would actually be able to learn something here from Jane Austen. However, I also need to say the obvious here and go back to what I have actually professed, which is, if you remember, we are reading Jane Austen because aesthetic work, because her writing is a way of fulfilling complex aspirations that have to do with instruction, with emotion, and with pleasure. Docere, movere, placere. The three verbs here are all important, but the one that is really important is the one that says enjoy, that is take pleasure. Do not think that for a moment that you must be reading Jane Austen for any kind of lesson. Do not think for a moment that any of the books that you pick up because it's a favorite book is there because it carries a lesson. Think about it as a moment of sheer pleasure, of a kind of gratuitous pleasure that maybe, if it's Jane Austen, enables you to discover beauty and virtue. If you decide to reread Jane Austen, I imagine you're going to be laughing more and you're going to be able to learn more. But if you read any other book, trust it, as long as it is not too trashy, trust it, that it will give you just what you need now, the pleasure of fantasy and the pleasure of escape. Thank you for being my audience.